Hello and good afternoon, dear colleagues, dear friends, dear students. My name is Jana Roschker and I'm a sinology professor from the University of Ljubljana. And I would like to take this opportunity first and foremost to thank the organizers of this intriguing workshop at the Tsinghua University in Beijing for inviting me. And it is a great honor for me and also a great pleasure to have the opportunity to be speaking here today. And in my talk, I will speak about some methodological problems in transcultural philosophy, especially regarding, of course, the Chinese and European or Chinese and Euro-American philosophy. And I will be focusing upon the post-comparative approaches and the method of sublation. This is a new and innovative method that I am suggesting in the framework of transcultural philosophy. And I will also, in the second half of my talk, I will try to demonstrate the working, the functioning of this new method on the example of derived from classical Chinese logic. So let's begin. Yeah. In this presentation, I would like to address problems encountered by Western scholars working in the field of Chinese philosophy, including, of course, the Chinese logic. I will begin with a discussion of the cross-cultural and transcultural methodologies and highlight some of the most common problems encountered in traditional cross-cultural comparisons in the field of philosophical logic. Considering the current state of the so-called post-comparative discourses in the field of transcultural philosophy, and starting from the notion of culturally divergent frames of reference, I will focus on semantic aspects of Chinese philosophical tradition and demonstrate the need for discursive translations. On this basis, I will then suggest new post-comparative approach in transcultural philosophical studies in Chinese philosophy and logic. In the framework of such approaches, I propose the application of an innovative principle based on what can tentatively be called the method of sublation, but of course this is open to debate. So this concrete working or functioning of this method will be introduced or demonstrated in the second half of my talk, but now in the first half, let's go back to the theory. So, yeah, and we will start with clarifying the notions cross-cultural, intercultural, and transcultural. All these notions are often using interchangeably, but they denote something different. So cross-cultural studies refer to different cultures or comparisons between them in a very general sense, namely of crossing the boundaries of one culture and entering into the discourses shaped by another. Interculturality is a more specific type of communication or interaction between different intellectual, linguistic, and cognitive traditions, where the differences in cultures and the corresponding linguistic structures have a decisive influence on the formation of meaning. In this sense, intercultural interactions certainly involve the process of transferring meanings, implications, and connotations between different cultures. Nevertheless, numerous current theorists criticize the very notion of cross or interculturality with its problematic embedding into a static and one-dimensional understanding of cultures as realms, spheres, or islands. In such a view, the very idea of culture is defined by a separatist, essentialistic, and isolating character. Therefore, many contemporary scholars argue instead for a transcultural approach because the prefix trans contained in the notion of, in this compound of transculturality, suggests that it is capable of transcending, going beyond the boundaries and limits of a fixed and static notion of culture. In this sense, it suggests the possibility of going beyond the fragmentation or separation of different cultures and philosophies, thus creating a more inclusive and enriching approach to philosophies. So transcultural approaches aim at overcoming also this outdated, static, and immobile concept of culture. But this does not mean by any means that there is no culture. Of course there is culture. It is still a real thing, like language, for instance. Both are dynamic, historically grown, and constantly changing entities without fixed borders. Therefore, the ontological assumption underlying the concept of culture does not necessarily refer to a metaphysics of an abstract substantial being. This is not a substantial entity. The concept of culture in this understanding is seen to be based on a metaphysics of relations. All the factors, the changing factors that constitute this entity are mutually related and influence each other. Now, on the basis of this reflection, let us return to the basic question, which is linked to problems encountered by Western or Western-trained scholars who are dealing with Chinese philosophy and logic. From the transcultural point of view, working in Chinese logic and interpreting Chinese text has much to do with transferring meanings across different languages and patterns of understanding. But as we all know, concepts and categories cannot be simply and directly transferred from one sociocultural context to another. The semantic connotations by which they are defined often do not overlap. Therefore, we must consider the referential frameworks into which they are embedded. Actually, what we are here confronting is a universal problem which has been discussed by a broad scope of Western theories, by Kuhn, Lakatos, Feyerabend, and so on. So, frameworks of reference is a notion that has been, although in a different denunciation, already highlighted by Professor Feng Yaoming, who will also be speaking here today, but 30 years ago, or more than 30 years ago already. So he is not very much keen to speaking about it anymore. But he denoted them frameworks of premises or frameworks of presumptions. He actually started describing these networks because he wanted to prove the incommensurability of different culturally conditioned frameworks of reference. I do not agree with the incommensurability between different cultures. But what he wanted also, but what he also pointed out was precisely the fact that referential networks or network of presumptions, how he calls them, are not necessarily occurring only in different cultures. Different frameworks do not pertain only to different cultures. So he reminded us in this context to the theories of Einstein, to the physical theories of Einstein and Newton. As we all know, they were written in the same language, in English, and they were both working with the same concept, more or less. But because these theories were embedded in two different referential frameworks, the functions and the semantic connotations of these same notions applied in each of them are also different. So this is actually very similar, a very similar thing that what Thomas Kuhn in his famous book on the structure of scientific revolutions has denoted paradigm with the term paradigm. A paradigm shift for him does not only change the meaning of particular terms or notions, it changes all the meanings of all the important, crucial notions applied within a theory. I think that in this context, the term paradigm is too broad, because paradigm actually means nothing more than a pattern. But notwithstanding the name, the problem remains the same. As we can see in this quotation, what we are talking about is a coherent semantic network of meanings and their mutual relations. Just remember what I just said about the relation between Newton and Einstein, and the both theories, they were created, and both theories, they were created by them. So what is this framework of references? It is, of course, different cultures also produce different frameworks of reference, and it is actually a principle that the more two geopolitical, cultural, linguistic areas are apart from each other, the more they're isolated from each other, the further apart they develop their traditions, the greater is the possibility of a certain incommensurability between the referential frameworks in which their philosophical theories are embedded. So, yeah, but what is actually a referential framework? It can be defined as a relational structure and dynamic, changeable structure of concepts, categories, terms, and ideas, which are applied in the cognitive processing of the objects of comprehension. It also includes paradigms and perspectives that influence and define the comprehension and evaluation of particular semantic elements within this structure, as well as the structure as a whole. In other words, it defines every concept applied in the theory, and it also determines its specific semantic connotations. And in the same way, it defines the relations between concrete notions as well as the entire network of these relations as such. Here, we start from the assumption that using different languages and different patterns of thought associated with their individual grammatic structures, different cultures continuously create different frames of reference that assume an influential role in human understanding and interpretation of a given reality. So such frames of reference are comprehensive instruments that filter perceptions and create meanings. Different reference frames can lead to different descriptions and interpretations of one and the same objective reality. So knowledge of these specific frames of reference that have emerged in the historical development of particular individual philosophies, or that were culturally also conditions to a certain degree. The knowledge of this is of paramount importance in order to interpret certain concepts from one tradition cultural tradition into another or into the framework of the global philosophy. So in this context, the methods of discursive translations are of utmost importance. For translations are necessarily also interpretations of the multiple connotations of concepts and categories embedded in different semantic and referential frameworks. Moreover, translations of different logical systems that belong to different semantic frameworks, different linguistic structures, and different methodological paradigms or principles can never be limited to merely translating one language into another. They must also involve the translation or transposition of different discourses, as well as interpretations of individual textual and linguistic structures, categories, concepts, and evaluation criteria that differ according to the corresponding socio-cultural contexts. So the problem of transferring meanings, however, goes further and also concerns the very concept of philosophical comparison. Why is the method of comparison actually important in this context? It is always important for Western scholars who are dealing with Chinese philosophy or vice versa, because we have been socialized and educated in a certain culture, and when we are socialized and we start to investigate texts and contents that belong to a different culture, we are always consciously or unconsciously comparing it, at least with, it is better if we are consciously doing this, with concepts and categories and paradigms and principles that were developed in our own tradition. So in this sense, we are always comparing in this wider sense. But many scholars see the main problem of such transcultural, intercultural comparisons in the fact that we have a unifying methodology and one single philosophical language, and that we apply that on culturally concrete and different materials. Now, in my view, this problem goes even farther. They're even more complex and go even deeper, because the methodology in question is always a system underlying one of the philosophies under comparison, namely the Western one. So the criteria for evaluations of philosophies that are being compared is always determined by one of the two comparanda, but one of the two objects of comparison, which commonly belongs to the methodology and terminology of Western philosophy, which is, of course, a relic of the colonial, post-colonial period in which the majority of political and economic power was concentrated in the so-called Western area. And although today, of course, this shift of the balance of the political and economic power has shifted long ago from the European to the Asian region, but still this axiological criteria in the methodology and theory are still, and values are still pertaining as universal, as a kind of universal criteria or value, as a kind of standard. And this is probably connected to the fact that we are living the globalization. The current situation is a result of modernization, and modernization was something which was important, which was imported from Europe to the rest of the world. This is probably the reason because of which these Orientalist and Eurocentric approaches are still alive and they're still very influential. But let's go back. So there is no third objective methodology if we are comparing two philosophies. And the tertium comparationis is always determined by one of the two comparanda, which commonly belongs to the methodology and terminology of Western philosophy. So there is a kind of imbalance in this regard. So based on a thorough reflection and analysis of such issue inherent in traditional comparative procedures, many scholars have elaborated new methodological tools that could overcome such problematic approaches. Such experimentalisms and new models of transcultural philosophizing have been termed post-comparative philosophies. Such methods aim to develop new modes of transcultural philosophizing rather than doing traditional comparative philosophy. In other words, they are based upon procedures of conceptual comparing rather than merely comparing discrete concepts. This challenging idea is based upon a self-critical account of the comparative philosophy that has been long overdue. Two of the most widely accepted methods of such post-comparative approaches are denoted philosophy of fusion and philosophy of synthesis, respectively. But I do not like very much either of them. And I will show you why. Because the notion of fusion, if we start with the notion of fusion, it seems to be a rather unlucky terminological choice. For it refers to the process as a result of joining two or more things together to form a single entity. It is often even associated with the process of melting, which normally results in a unity in which particular elements of the two or more entities that have been melted or fused together become completely unrecognizable and are essentially alienated. The amalgamated unity which arises through a fusion is, of course, a qualitatively new substance. Now, if we consider fusion as a metaphor for a certain mode of philosophical reasoning, then we have to admit, of course, that new philosophical insights are always based on new cognitive substances. Yet, genuine philosophizing as a creative process can hardly be based upon an amalgamated unity of distorted elements, of course. For it must be based upon, it should be based upon certain discrete philosophical grounds, which cannot be alienated altogether. So let's take a look to the synthesis philosophy. Synthesis is also a qualitatively new stage of development, which is all right, of course, and one in which some elements of the two or more entities from which it arises are preserved and others are discarded. But precisely in philosophy, the term synthesis is often overburdened with the orthodox Hegelian view. Not the view of Hegel, but the Hegelian lines of thought, because Hegel himself never actually spoke about thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and so on. But still, it was this terminology is derived from later philosophers, but still synthesis is being seen as a result of two reciprocally excluding and mutually contradictive entities, while comparisons can include both distinctions and commonalities of the comparanda. An additional and perhaps even more severe problem arises when we consider that the mechanistic nature of such dialectical processes which result in a synthesis. Because they seem to develop through and by themselves, and to proceed more or less automatically from one stage to the next. Thus, synthesis philosophy would probably mostly be seen as something that fails to provide space for new conceptions created by individual minds. So, within the framework of such culturally and conceptually sensible approaches, I propose a new method for transferring meanings from Chinese to global philosophy, namely the method of sublation. Although the term sublation also forms a part of the Hegelian lines of thought and could hence be problematic, it is still much more depleted than the concept of synthesis. Because of the following reasons. First of all, its Latin origin encompasses all three notions that are crucial, that are of crucial importance for any process of creating something new from interactions between two or more different objects or phenomena. In this philosophical sense, it has the three connotations of eliminating, preserving, and arising. Besides, in contrast to synthesis or fusion, the notion of sublation refers to a process rather than to a stage. So actually in the Hegelian philosophy, this is the notion Aufhebung, and the English term sublation was actually composed from the Greek, the Latin term sublatio, sublatio, and which has these three connotations. But I think it is a rather interesting term that can be also applied in the framework of these post-comparative philosophies, because this approach is not only about identifying differences and similarities between two or more philosophical discourses. With this method, certain aspects derived from philosophies of different cultures can be used contrastively as inspirations for our own philosophizing. In this sense, the tension between those contrastive aspects of philosophical perception and interpretation of reality can help us raise our idea to a new level and to provide us a new insight by preserving certain elements of both aspects and eliminating others, and by creating a shift out of the tension which is created by the opposing views. So in this way, it is possible to transcend the static notions of cultures in which philosophies under comparisons were embedded. So in this talk, I will try to demonstrate the concrete working of this method, exemplify it, and I will follow the basic structure of the sublation process, which goes, as we can see on the right side of this slide. First, we start by identifying similarities between the two or more comparanta. Then we identify differences between them, but with regard to the referential frameworks in which they are embedded. Then in the next step, we decide which elements of these opposing notions we are going to eliminate and which one we are going to preserve. And after that, we proceed to the fourth stage of the whole process, to the sublation itself, which means that due to this tension and to the consciously chosen preserving of certain presumptions, we raise our thought to a new level, and this brings us to a new insight or a new idea or new proposition. First, I wanted to demonstrate this method through three examples. First, Hui Shi and Zeno. Then, secondly, the example of Augustinus and Mozart and their respective views on the relation between time and reality. And then the third example would be Russell and Zhang Dong-sun regarding their structural epistemologies. But because of the time limitations, I will only try to exemplify this method on one example, and the first one through a comparison between Hui Shi and Zeno. So there are many people who want to compare them because their paradoxical statements are often very similar. From his 10 postulates of all that exists, it is clear that Hui Shi derives his theorems from the assumption of the organic and structural connectedness of all that exists. And the similarity is that Zeno also assumes the inseparable interconnectedness of everything that exists. But unlike Hui Shi, he sees this existential interconnectedness as the expression of an undivided and unchanging wholeness. So many people have, for instance, have tried to compare these two theorems. Hui Shi says, if we take a stick of 1 chi's length and cut off half of it every day, we shall never come to an end of it. And Zeno says, Achilles, in his story about the Achilles and the slower was later in late antiquity replaced by the turtle, and so this story went into the history of European thought as the story about Achilles and the turtle. But in the beginning, it was only Achilles and the slower. So Zeno pointed out that the slower runner will never be overtaken by the swiftest, by Achilles, since the pursuer must first reach the point from which the pursuit started, and so the slower must always be ahead. So yeah, although Hui Shi proceeds from a relativist understanding of time and space, and Zeno from the endeavor to negate possibility of movement, there is a similarity in both propositions regarding their basic understanding of the relation between infinity and finality. So they both proceed from the hypothesis that spatial length is not reducible to minimum units, but is infinitely reducible. So, but we will not now talk about these sticks and Achilles and turtles. We will, I will try to demonstrate the working of the method of sublation on the example of their respective theorems regarding the flying arrows. So, at the first glance, they are very similar, although the first the two scholars were separated by great distances. Both are concerned with the observation of flying arrows and the mechanic of flying arrows, namely with the question whether these flying arrows actually move or not. Are they in motion or are they in still stand? So we will proceed. This is the structure of the sublation method, and the first step is are the similarities. These two similar theses to be compared are first Zeno's assumption that the flying arrow does not move, and second Hui Shi's assertion that at a given time a flying arrow does not move but does not stand still either. So as we can see, Hui Shi, Zeno's assumption of that there can be no motion has led him to believe that the flying arrow is at rest. And Hui Shi discovered a similar problem. He said, 足使之极而有不行不止之时. So there is a flying arrow, there is a time in which the tip of the flying arrow is the problem with the tip of the flying arrow is that there is a time when it does not move, nor does it stand still. So when we want to identify the similarities, we can start with Zeno. His assumption that there can be no motion has also led him to believe that the flying arrow is at rest. So Hui Shi also discovered something that is at the first glance similar, as we have seen. But actually the similarity of these two statements is quite superficial, for it only rests on the fact that both scholars aim to investigate the spatial, temporal, and mechanic states of a flying arrow, and on the fact that their arguments differ from what we commonly assume about the state of flying arrows. But if this similarity is only apparent, where are the differences? I mean, the similarity is also, we could say, not only that they were both engaged in the observation of flying arrows and the analysis of the mechanics of flying arrows, but they also both stated something which is in a great discrepancy with what the common sense would say. Because if we ask any of the so-called normal people if the flying arrow is moving or is it in stillstand, they will all say that it is, of course, in motion. So, but let us take a look at the differences now between these two propositions, and we will try to identify these differences by their respective referential frameworks. So Zeno starts from a referential framework whose basic paradigm is the unchanging static nature of being. There cannot be no change in the being. Hui Shi's paradox, on the other hand, is embedded into the dynamic framework of change, and this is a big difference. So let us analyze these differences. If we start with Zeno, since every object or entity is a form of being identical with itself, they're all necessarily immutable and static. Zeno was a faithful disciple of Parmenides, who thus sought to confirm his teacher's theory that reality is one, indivisible, and immovable. With this view, Zeno explained the impossibility of change and motion. Thus, for any form of being in this totality, there can be neither a change in space nor a change in time. Therefore, the motion of the flying arrow is in reality an illusion. It is a sum of innumerable static sections of space. It is not motion. In this way, Zeno actually denies the continuity of motion by dividing it into a series of successive, mutually isolated sequences of static space. For Hui Shi, on the other hand, every object or entity has a multifaceted nature and can change in dependence of the viewpoint of the observant, which is always relative, of course. Hui Shi's presumption is relativistic, which means that his basic paradigm, namely the paradigm of change and motion, is also not absolute. It can only exist in dialectical relation with stillstand. According to the commentaries of Sima Biao from the Jin dynasty, Hui Shi here proceeds from the two basic properties of the arrow, namely its form, Xing, and its potential, Shi. It is interesting that Jin Yuelin, for instance, the founder of this department of philosophy at the Tsinghua University, has also divided the Dao and reality. His ontology was based on the categories of form and potential, but for him, form was Shi and potential was Nang, and it was at the same time matter. Okay, but let's go back to Hui Shi. So the form of the arrow is always unchanging, no matter in which space or in which time of this one flight it is located. But the potential is the property that allows and also causes its motion. So while the form is fixed and unchangeable and thus unmovable in the time and space of the flying arrow, its potential causes its movement. So there is a time in which the flying arrow is at rest, and at the same time, it is in motion. So let's proceed to the third step, to the dialectic. So in this sense, Hui Shi's proposition includes Zenon's argument, but due to its insufficiency, it also negates it, and it also expands it in a certain sense. Because Zenon argues that the flying arrow stands still. In Hui Shi's view, it does not stand still, although it also does not move. What do we preserve and what do we eliminate in this dialectic of conflicting oppositions? Or of conflicting statements? What? So let us take a look. Okay. From the viewpoint of form and potential, the flying arrow is, of course, at rest. However, it is also not at rest because it is moving. In order to make room for a new understanding of the fundamental question of the existence and nature of motion, we decide to start from the processual view, which is, of course, closer to Hui Shi's theory. And the reason for this decision is that dynamic flow is wider and leaves us more space for identifying new aspects of the basic question. The processual view can include both static and moving phases, whereas the dynamics can include static, whereas the opposite is not true. The static phases cannot include motion. So the dynamic can include static, but not vice versa. So we eliminate Zeno's basis presumption according to which there can be no movement. because entities of being that are identifiable with themselves cannot occupy different spaces. We remove this static point of view. Instead, we preserve the processual presumption according to which a flying arrow is, from the perspective of its potential, moving, but from the perspective of its form, it simultaneously stands still. And let's proceed to the fourth step. This is the sublation. So now we have the problem that how to create this shift from these two oppositional notions. This perspective is not an exhaustive explanation that we have preserved, this Sima Biao's interpretation. It is not an exhaustive explanation of Hui Shi's flying arrow proposition, because he does not say that there is a time in which the flying arrow is simultaneously moving and in stillstand. He says the opposite, actually, namely that there is a time in which a flying arrow is simultaneously not moving and not in stillstand. There is a tension between these opposing notions, and this tension can lead us to a shift, a sublation of the two arguments. Let's take a look. How? So according to the form and potential argument, the flying arrow moves and stands still at the same time. However, as mentioned above, this is not what Hui Shi explicitly says, for he states the opposite. But it is clear that we might see a new perspective in Hui Shi's flying arrow argument if we could explicitly connect the two perspectives. Therefore, we will sublate the argument of simultaneous movement and stillstand in order to arrive at Hui Shi's opposite statement. This can be done how? When we place the first argument, if we place the first argument in the framework of moist philosophy, or more concretely, in its explanation of the concept of antinomy, using the example of a herd containing two kinds of animals, namely oxen and horses, a herd which simultaneously includes oxen and horses, cannot be called a herd of oxen and neither a herd of horses, of course. So considering and reapplying this formal type of antinomy, the following can analogously be claimed. If there is a time in which there is simultaneously movement and stillstand, this is also a time in which is not determined by pure movement and neither by pure stillstand. In other words, the reason because of which such time is a moment in which the flying arrow is not in movement and neither in stillstand is precisely because that very same moment comprises both movement and stillstand, and non-movement and non-stillstand, and can thus not be reduced to either of them. It is a moment in time in which there is no movement and no stillstand, because it is movement and stillstand. So now we can look at the new insight that has been brought about by this sublation. In this way, the use of the sublation method has led us to a new reinterpretation of Hui Shi's flying arrow paradox. This reinterpretation is based upon a threefold insight, and this is this threefold insight. First of all, the apparent similarity of Zeno's and Hui Shi's flying arrow argument is only superficial because they're both embedded in different referential frameworks. So then we look at the second insight, the B, insight denoted B, the processual nature of Hui Shi's framework of reference leads us to the form and potential argument. which allows for the simultaneous movement in stillstand. And C, the third insight, simultaneous movement in stillstand can be transferred into simultaneous non-movement and non-stillstand by consideration of the Maoist conception of antinomy. So I hope that this demonstration has helped us to understand the meaning and the process of the so-called sublation method, the similarities identified went beyond the boundaries of the respective cultural contexts in which they were originally developed. The identification of the differences did not proceed from the search for differences in the cultural background, but from different paradigms determined by the two frames of reference in which the respective sentences were developed. In this way, it is possible to overcome the state of notion of cultures in which the philosophies being compared were embedded. In other words, the sublation method can help us overcome the time and space that determine certain notions shaped by different cultural discourses. So, but this, when I was speaking again about this overcoming or overbridging time and space, it is a good conclusion, because when we are speaking of time and space, then I can always remember that my time in my presentation time, my talk time in this virtual digital space has ended, and so I will now leave the floor for your respective questions, critical comments, or questions simply. And I would, before that, I would like to thank all of you for your patient listening. Thank you very much.